Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hey guys, Britain's Vietnam War. Preemptive like. Now, I don't know if this is Britain aiding in the American Vietnam War or if this was before that or what's going on here, but I'm ready to learn. Let's go. My name's Connor. If you're new, hope you're all doing well. Original link to the video from Real Time History, top of the description. Let's go.
But there's fresh fighting in Vietnam. Fall 1945. The Second World War is over, but there's fresh fighting in Vietnam.
Okay.
Now former enemies become allies as British Indian troops, French commandos, and surrendered Japanese soldiers join in a ragtag alliance against
British Indian troops, French commandos, and surrendered Japanese soldiers. That's a ragtag group. So this is cool. This is in between American Vietnam War and the end of World War II, which is even more interesting. So I'm happy with that.
Ho Chi Minh's communists in Saigon. The outcome will shape Vietnam's future for decades to come in Great Britain's weird Vietnam War.
Operation Masterdom.
In 1940, the French colony of Indochina, today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, is on the front line in both the Second Sino-Japanese and the Second World War. In September, Japanese forces occupy northern Vietnam to cut off their Chinese enemies from Allied supplies via the Yunnan-Haiphong Railway. Japan also forces the Vichy French authorities governing Indochina to provide economic and transit rights in exchange for France keeping nominal control. In 1941, though, Japan occupies the entire colony.
Wait, so that was under Vichy France control, which was a French puppet government of the Germans who were allied with the Japanese. So why would the Japanese invade? Did I understand that right? Invade Vichy France.
Now control. In 1941, though, Japan occupies the entire colony. Now Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam after 3 decades abroad. He softens his Marxist-Leninist ideology in favor of a broader independence movement. In 1941, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is absorbed into the larger League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh. Its goal is to get all parts of Vietnamese society to resist the Japanese occupation and French colonialism. Rich people, soldiers, workers, peasants, intellectuals, employees, traders, youth, and women who warmly love your country. As one in mind and strength, we shall overthrow the Japanese and French and their jackals in order to save people from the situation between boiling water and burning heat. The Viet Minh conduct a limited guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, but they lack experience. When the US joins the war in 1941, Ho Chi Minh has high hopes for President Roosevelt's anti-imperial discourse. Ho pledges the Viet Minh to the Allied powers and tries to contact US intelligence in China. At first, though, there's little cooperation until Japan overthrows the Vichy French in March 1945 and arrests French troops. The US sends an Office of Strategic Services team to Vietnam.
Guys, question. How much, oh, this is a question about American history stuff, so I wonder how much of the anti-imperialist rhetoric from, say, Roosevelt was due more to, I tend to be more of a pessimistic person, so I'm going to think it's more the latter, but to be more genuinely just anti-imperialist and trying to turn a new page in East Asia, or if it's just that, you know, it weakens a lot of European powers, and so that's the more major reasoning. I tend to be kind of pessimistic and think like nothing in world politics is usually good faith, and it's more some kind of backroom, not so good faith, but more so just strategic.
Vietnam.
Does that make sense?
French troops. The U.S. sends an officer.
Sorry,
Divisions in China. At first, though, there's little cooperation until Japan overthrows the Vichy French in March 1945 and arrests French troops. The U.S. sends an Office of Strategic Services team to Vietnam in July 1945, which trains and arms the Viet Minh, but Japan's capitulation in August ends official support. Instead, Ho marches on Hanoi as the Viet Minh take control of Tonkin province.
Now he's got to be quick, and that, like, okay, the Japanese are defeated, but now the French or Americans or whoever are going to try and or come back in and set it up. And so you got to be quick to make sure, like, nope, this is Vietnam now.
Home marches on Hanoi as the Viet Minh take control of Tonkin province. The Viet Minh are generally popular in the north, especially due to their efforts to distribute food in the 1944-45 famine. And Ho's revolution culminates in announcing Vietnamese independence on September 2nd. U.S. OSS agents are at the ceremony and even salute the Viet Minh flag. OSS representative Archimedes Paddy even becomes a local celebrity. Paddy himself is impressed with Ho. On the day of the proclamation of independence and right before being recalled from the mission, he sends a sober outlook for the future of Vietnam to his higher-ups. Ho Chi Minh impresses me as a sensible, well-balanced, politically minded individual. His demands are few and simple, namely limited independence, liberation from French rule, the right to live as free people in a family of nations, and lastly, the right to deal directly with the outside world.
Limited independence.
From what I've seen, these people mean business, and I'm afraid that the French will have to deal with them. For that matter, we will all have to deal with them.
Foreshadowing.
Although Roosevelt opposed the return of French colonial power after the war, his successor, President Truman, has other concerns. He's sympathetic to Vietnamese nationalism, but also wants a restored France as a reliable ally against the Soviet Union in Europe. Ho sends letters to Truman asking for recognition, but State Department officials prevent their delivery. Instead, the U.S. announces it is...
So it's basically saying, I wanted your independence, but not more than I want, but we feel like you could be influenced by our enemy in the Soviet Union. And this is what's so kind of depressing about it's that the only good guys and bad guys, I think, it's too simple to call everyone that. But if you're going to call anyone a good guy, it's going to be the one fighting for their own homeland, for their own independence, right? But then when it comes down to it, and there's a fear that your greater enemy could influence these people, and then you go back on it. International politics or relations are just...
not a State Department officials prevent their delivery. Instead, the U.S. announces it is not against French sovereignty.
They did what? They didn't let it... Sorry.
Ho sends letters to Truman asking for recognition, but State Department officials prevent their delivery. Instead, the U.S. announces it is not against French sovereignty in Indochina, but will not intervene to restore it. The U.S. does participate in the post-war division of Vietnam into two zones. Despite the ongoing Chinese Civil War, nationalist China is to occupy the north and the British the south. Meanwhile, Ho's provisional government spreads its influence, though the Chinese occupation, which includes widespread looting, limits his power base in Tonkin. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese set up a Southern Viet Minh Committee in Saigon, the political and economic center of the southern Annam province. But the Viet Minh is weaker inside Saigon and rushes to establish its presence before British troops arrive. Luckily for them, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur delays the British arrival until after he accepts the Japanese surrender, meaning they arrive a week late on September 11th. This gives the Viet Minh time to establish a small power base, but the British force, mostly Indian troops, lands alongside French troops, including Free French commandos.
Wait, why though? Oh, okay. Why would he delay British? Okay.
Although troops lands alongside French troops, including Free French commandos. Although there's some internal disagreement, Britain has decided to support French control. Britain is concerned about anti-colonialism spreading to their own colonies occupied by Japan during the war. A restored French Indochina, on the other hand, can trade with British colonies and solidify France as a powerful ally. The potential threat to Australia, New Zealand, India, Burma, Malaya, and the East Indies archipelago, resulting from Indochina being in the hands of a weak or unfriendly power, has been sufficiently demonstrated by the action of Japan in the Second World War.
Okay. Yeah, so Japan, Germany defeated. World War II is essentially over. It is over. I mean, very recently for them, for people right now. And so the colonial possessions that were taken over by the Japanese, you want to make sure you get them back under control before local people, get their independence. And this is such a difficult thing. It's a demoralizing thing for me and just learning about history, because it seems like just the right thing to do and just allowing people to self-destiny, right? Well, I get their worry that you're going to be overtaken by the Soviets, and as much as I want to just be like, okay, you have to let people do what they want, that's what's right, you also have to think about the Soviet threat. But is that justification for just returning it to colonial power? I don't know, and I would... Okay.
To oversee the transition, codenamed Operation Mastodon, Britain sends Major General Douglas Gracie. His orders are specific: accept the Japanese surrender, process Japanese soldiers, and repatriate French prisoners. He is to avoid internal politics and not acknowledge Ho's government. When he arrives, he ignores a Vietnamese welcome delegation and later speaks of his distrust. I went out there after the war and saw the French after they'd been through a most uncomfortable time with the Japanese. I was welcomed on arrival by the Viet Minh, who said welcome and all that sort of thing. It was a very unpleasant situation, and I promptly kicked them out. They are obviously communists. When Gracie arrives, Saigon has no functional government. Rioting and looting is common, including by French former prisoners, as well as Vietnamese militant religious sects and other political groups. Although Ho Chi Minh calls for no violence, the Viet Minh conducts targeted killings of political enemies, including those who collaborated with French and Japanese. Still armed Japanese guards provide little security, while French residents demand Gracie restore their position. Gracie generally sides with the French, though he encourages them to soften their rule. But he only has 1,300 troops to process 70,000 Japanese soldiers. Security concerns in Saigon means that he arms French prisoners and brings Japanese guards into a scratch security force. British reinforcements are on the way, but will take weeks to arrive in full. Gracie's actions clash with his own superior, Lord Louis Mountbatten, as well as US OSS Representative Peter Dewey, who's much more critical of a French return. So Gracie declares Dewey persona non grata. On September 21st, 1945, Gracie decrees new rules for Saigon, extending a nighttime curfew and banning public demonstrations, and the unauthorized carry.
What does persona... Persona non grata is a Latin phrase that means unwelcome person. Okay. All right, I just want to make sure that...
of arms, time curfew, and banning public demonstrations, and the unauthorized carry of arms. Vietnamese groups complained the rules unfairly target them and accuse Gracie of impartiality. The Viet Minh responds with a general strike, which Gracie fears is just a prelude to an attack. Some Vietnamese groups, especially the Trotskyists, are planning one, but the Viet Minh mostly wants negotiations. On September 23rd, Gracie supports a French coup in Saigon, arming 1,400 French POWs who seize key buildings. In the struggle, 2 Frenchmen are killed and many Vietnamese civilians beaten. In retaliation, a group of Vietnamese, likely Trotskyists, attack a French residential district the next day, killing over 200, including women and children. Gracie arms more French prisoners, and by September 24th,
I don't know what the difference between a Trotskyist and a Leninist or Stalinist, or I don't really know the difference. I'm not going to pause and Google again because it's not that crucial to the story right now. But just if anyone does know the difference.
In retaliation, a group of Vietnamese, likely Trotskyists, attack a French residential district the next day, killing over 200, including women and children. Gracie arms more French prisoners, and by September 24th, general street fighting breaks out. Ho Chi Minh is distressed by events, but publicly supports the uprising, as does the Southern Viet Minh Committee. Grab weapons and rise up to force out the invading forces. Wipe out the French bandits, wipe out their collaborators. At first, the Viet Minh isolate Saigon and fight conventionally. They also try to seize key transport nodes like the Bin Loi Bridge. However, British Indian troops repel the attacks and bring in supplies via river barges. The Viet Minh launch attacks inside the city, and one of their ambushes kills Peter Dewey. The Viet Minh claim their men mistook his unmarked jeep for a French vehicle, and Dewey is the first American killed in Vietnam. British Indian troops relieve Saigon by September 28th, but the small force is exhausted, so Gracie turns to the Japanese for help. But Japanese allegiance is ambiguous, and some soldiers prefer to remain in Indochina than be repatriated to Japan. After interviewing Japanese veterans, historian Kiuchi Tachikawa outlined their reasons. First, support for the independence movement. Second, avoiding war crime prosecution. Third, some had the chance to meet local people and became convinced to stay. Rumors spoke of Japan having turned into a burnt field, that if they returned, there would be nothing to eat. Some of these stay-behinds go on to cooperate with Viet Minh groups, including training and directing operations. Gracie notes the Japanese commander is angry at his troops' behavior, but has little control. Even so, Japanese troops become instrumental in British operations, including rescuing French prisoners from Viet Minh troops in Saigon. From October 1st to 10th, there's a ceasefire, which ends when the Viet Minh ambush a British Indian patrol. The brief pause is enough to bring in professional French troops under General Leclerc. British Indian troops stop attacks on Saigon's airport on October 12th, and with Saigon mostly secure, the British, French, Japanese force goes on the offensive. The objective is to secure the Triangle, an area between 3 towns northeast of Saigon. In this zone, Japanese troops can be concentrated, disarmed, and processed, but Viet Minh troops control the Triangle. From October 23rd to 25th, the British 100th Brigade clear out the 3 towns of Viet Minh and start processing Japanese prisoners. On October 24th, French troops secure towns in Saigon's southwest, while British troops burn down much of Saigon's commercial district in anti-Viet Minh operations. On October 29th, British-led forces in the Triangle are reformed into Gate Force, an armored car column now including 500 Japanese infantrymen. It moves east to preempt Viet Minh attacks. Another British force, Clarkall, in conjunction with French troops, heads northwest, while French armor moves into the Mekong Delta. At Xuan Loc, Gate Force encounters Viet Minh troops in a rubber plantation. The British use armored cars, while the Japanese launch a banzai attack at night. The Viet Minh conduct a banzai-style attack of their own, and the 2 forces clash in hand-to-hand combat. 250 Viet Minh and 1 Brit are killed, but the British do not record Japanese losses. The battle at Xuan Loc destroys the Viet Minh in that region. By November, Viet Minh resistance is crumbling under heavy losses, and the British accelerate processing Japanese troops. They hand over security to the French, who struggle against the resurgent Viet Minh in the Central Highlands. Gracie accepts the Japanese surrender on November 30th, and by late December, British troops start leaving Indochina. In early 1946, the British feel they've restored French sovereignty in Vietnam. They had not expected such resistance, and opposition at home and abroad is growing. Some in Britain's leftist Labour government question why Britain was assisting a French colonial adventure, and even some British officers criticized French behavior in Indochina.
Well, the main reason that was voice crack was they were fearing that French losses would lead to maybe British colonial losses too, right?
They really were a band of pretty unruly cutthroats. Their method of pacifying a village without any provocation was to drive through in American 3-ton trucks, 30 caliber machine guns on the cab, all guns firing on alternate sides of the street at first floor level. They seldom hit anyone, but if that is the way friends arrive, it is little wonder that the Vietnamese threw them out. Gracie also complains to Leclerc about French racism towards the British Indian troops, while Indian nationalists question why they're there at all. Indians watched with growing anger, shame, and helplessness that Indian troops should be used for doing Britain's dirty work against our friends, who are fighting the same fight as we. Britain wants out of Indochina and hopes the US will step in to support France. Gracie takes much of the blame, but his supporters claim he followed orders and made the best of a bad situation. In hindsight, some have questioned why Britain did so well against the Viet Minh in 1945, while the more powerful French and US forces later struggled. Firstly, the Viet Minh were nowhere near as sophisticated
Right, that maybe they just weren't as organized
in the 1940s as they became in the 1950s or later as the Viet Cong. There was internal division between Northerners and Southerners, and the Viet Minh was only one of several groups competing in Saigon. Commandos had very limited control of their troops, and there was little overarching strategy. Key figures like Ho Chi Minh and Pho Nguyen Giap remained in the north. The Viet Minh also stuck to conventional tactics, only turning to guerrilla methods once they lost Saigon. But even here they lacked experience or equipment. Few knew how to maintain a machine gun, and some even carried bows or bamboo spears. British Indian and Gurkha troops, on the other hand, had lots of experience fighting in Burma or from occupation duties on the violent northwestern Indian frontier. British commanders attacked with caution, keeping open a line of retreat. Despite the disobedience of some, Japanese troops also contributed greatly and did not oppose the British in an organized manner. Importantly, British goals in Vietnam were extremely limited, handing over control to the French and processing Japanese troops. It was clear when these objectives were achieved, and there was no need to pacify the entire country or even all of Saigon. The Vietnamese people, especially in the south, were also hesitant to support a new war. Some, including Ho Chi Minh, still hoped France would negotiate a liberal policy and roadmap to independence. But these hopes are uncertain. In the north, the Chinese Civil War causes Chinese nationalists to change their policy and allow the French to return if they enter into talks with Ho. For now, the future of Indochina might be decided at the negotiation table, but that option won't last long. 1945 was a turning point in warfare. Just a few weeks before Gracie landed in Saigon to engage in one of the first unconventional conflicts of the Cold War, the US had dropped 2 atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The unimaginable destructive power of the atomic bomb now had to be considered in future wars. But the potentially limitless energy could also be harnessed for civilian use, and indeed Joseph Stalin was keen to use it for his vision of atomic-powered communism. If you want to learn more about this topic, in our new series Red Atoms, we explore the origins of the first Soviet atom bomb all the way to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond. And where can you watch Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building.
I'll make sure to, if you're interested in Nebula, guys, make sure you use the links and promo codes from Real Time History. Original link, top of the description. You'll find the promo codes in their description. Has there ever been I'm trying to think, like Napoleonic Wars, World War I? No, I don't think so. Has there ever been, after such an incredible, destructive war like World War II, such an immediate switch to a new threat? You know, it just the fact that you're weaponizing, Germany and Japan, the main 2 actors in World War II, that after you defeat them, it's less about punishment and more about building them up, and in order to fight a new enemy. And the scale of the Second World War makes it even more crazy that after such a destructive, deadly war, you would go right to just like, okay, now you're on our side. This is a new kind of enemy. Has that ever happened? And also just for the Vietnamese, okay? The French have fought them, the British a little bit, right? The British never really fought them other than just as, helping out the French, for instance. They might have helped out. I think they did help out the Americans a bit. But you defeat or you ward off, you fight against the Japanese. The Japanese are defeated. And then, you fight against the French. Occupation of the French, and then the Japanese come in and take out the French. Then you fight against the Japanese, and then you fight against the French again, with a little British help and Japanese help and all of the ragtag kind of group of peoples who are in this. And then you fight against the Americans, and then you fight against the Chinese. It just still standing. It's kind of like I think of Poland, sort of. in just that it's so amazing that you are still around as a country. And I don't know how you can't respect that a lot. It's really interesting. So clearly it was out of fear of, you know, or hopefulness, maybe, either one, of helping out the French retake their colonial possessions would make it more likely for Britain to retake and retain their own ones, right? So I get that. But it's just so, the morality of it all. This goes for when the Americans are fighting the Vietnamese as well, maybe even more so, probably even more so. It's just the morality of it all is at first, you know, let Vietnam decide their own fate. But if as soon as you're like a commander and directing things, you have to think about Soviet implications or Soviet possible influence in the future if they are to determine their own destiny. And it's such a difficult thing. Is it less difficult than I'm thinking it is? I don't know. It's a great video. Very interesting. Would appreciate any comments down below, guys. Love you all. Hope you're all doing well. I'm going to play through the
together with other creators. Nebula is a platform where we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertiser guidelines, and where the viewers support us directly. This allows us to produce series like Red Adams or our World War II series 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45. And that's not all. Apart from watching other creators' original documentaries like the Battle of Britain series from Real Engineering, your Nebula subscription also includes classes where you can learn useful skills directly from Nebula creators. In our newest class, I take you through the entire production process of a real-time history video and give a glimpse behind the scenes of what it takes to produce a great history documentary. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you get 40% off an annual subscription and support our channel at the same time. For just $30, you can watch Nebula Originals, all our content ad-free and earlier than on YouTube, other Nebula creators, and also Nebula classes, and much more. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below.
It's a great video as always. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments, and hopefully I'll see you next video. Bye, guys.